Welcome to my World History Notes, where I read from the book I wrote to teach homeschoolers world history. A Bible believer looks at world history. It goes up through the end of World War II. I've discussed why previously. And you can purchase my book on lulu.com, amazon.com, or at the Bible Baptist Bookstore, or just follow me here. So we're going back to the unfinished in the Pacific today. The Japanese had invaded Papua New Guinea in the summer and fall of 1942, but were driven out the following year by Australian and American forces. In July of 1942, the Americans prepared for operations against the Japanese held Guadalcanal, which proved one of the most intense battles of the war, with American forces once again displaying, as they did over and over in both theaters of operation, their incredible bravery and willingness to sacrifice. Guadalcanal wasn't secured until February of 1943, with thousands of casualties. Battles raged all over the Pacific as the Americans and other allied forces, including Dutch, Australian, and British, tried to dislodge the determined Japanese from the positions they had conquered. The three aircraft carriers that had escaped the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Lexington, Saratoga, and the Enterprise, were instrumental in delivering attacks on Japanese held Gilbert and Marshall Islands. On April 18, 1942, to give a little back to Japan what America had received at their hands, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led a daring raid 800 miles to bomb Tokyo. Not having enough gas to fly back, all the planes were forced down in China, except for one that landed in Russian territory, where the crew members were locked up by our wonderful Russian allies. All of the flyers eventually returned, except the two Japanese beheaded, thanks in part to patriot and Baptist missionary John Birch. One of the downed flyers of the Doolittle raid, Jacob de Shazer, a Christian who wrote a book about his experiences. Later, after the war, the Japanese pilot who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, Mitsuo Fuchida, read the book, got saved, and then became an evangelist. Under General Douglas MacArthur, the American Allied troops, excuse me, began island hopping, taking one Japanese-held island at a time in bloody fighting. I read recently, this is not in the book, I read recently in a book on the Japanese uptick to World War II, that the Army had complained to the Navy that, we can't possibly hold, no army in the world is big enough to hold the amount of territory that you want to take. And that's what happened. And the Army was left holding the bag. The Navy couldn't resupply. So units were cut off on different islands, left to their own devices, and died to the last man in many cases. So often Japanese who would refuse to surrender would die almost to the man, and some individual soldiers did not even come out of hiding until 30 years later. Names like Iwo Jima, Tarawa, Saipan, and Rabaul are memorials to the tenacity of the Japanese soldier, to the bravery and determination of his opposite, the American citizen soldier, not fighting for an emperor or even for his president, but for his nation and its flag, and really for his buddies. The American won because Americans were free to choose their leaders and were not considered mere servants of their political rulers. Certainly, Americans were drafted into service, but many hundreds of thousands joined voluntarily to fight both the Japanese and the Germans. Even Japanese Americans whose families were interned in concentration camps fought the Nazi juggernaut as the loyal American citizens they were. As a child, I knew a man who had been on the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor, and men who had fought all over Europe and the Pacific. I had an uncle with Patton in France and Germany who still cried when he told about shooting his first man. An uncle in North Africa with Operation Torch who was still terrified when he talked of the Kasserine Pass. And many other relatives who served in the occupation of Japan or Germany, and even in the merchant marine facing the U-boat threat. Finally, the Japanese were brought to the surrender table on the USS Missouri after the newest weapon of mass murder, the atomic bomb, was dropped on two of their cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I personally talked to a Japanese citizen who admitted that Japan deserved those bombs, although many military leaders at the time were against it. This is back in the 1970s. Believing not what the history books say, that the Japanese would have fought the Americans to the last man and perhaps inflicted a million casualties, but they were ready. But they were ready they were ready to surrender. So the let me read that again. I personally talked to Japanese citizens who admitted that Japan deserved those bombs, although many military leaders at that time were against it, believing not what the history books say, that the Japanese would have fought the Americans to the last man and inflicted perhaps a million casualties, but that they were ready to surrender. Admiral William Leahy urged President Truman, who had followed FDR into office, not to drop the bomb on Japan. He was ahead over the combined U.S.-UK chiefs of staff, and he called dropping the bomb barbaric and inhumane, and insisted the Japanese were ready to surrender. 7 weeks before the bombs were dropped, the Emperor of Japan sought peace initiatives, a way to surrender. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, one of World War II's heroes, insisted that the Japanese had sued for peace even before the existence of the bomb was known. Admiral William Halsey of the U.S. Third Fleet called its use an experiment that proved nothing but that it could kill a lot of Japs. Many of the Navy leaders who were against the bomb insisted that a naval blockade would starve the island into submission. U.S. Army Air Force General Hap Arnold said it was unnecessary. Major General Curtis bombed them back into the Stone Age. LeMay, that was his quote, said that dropping the atomic bomb had nothing to do with ending the war. Flying Tiger General Chennault also said the bomb was not a decisive factor. The list of military men against its use goes on and on. However, most modern history books insist that it was the dropping of the atomic bombs that ended the war with Japan. The Soviet Union finally broke its agreement to not fight Japan on August 8th and declared war on the defeated nation so that it could grab up whatever territories that were available, particularly in the northern part of Korea. Hiroshima had received the atomic bomb on August 6th, so the USSR waited to join in 2 days later. On August 9th, Nagasaki was destroyed. Japan formally surrendered on September 2nd, 1945. Churchill, FDR, and Stalin met for the last time at the Yalta Conference the previous February on the Crimean Peninsula. During this conference, Churchill had pressed for free elections in Eastern Europe, which was under Soviet control, but Stalin insisted that the satellite states in Eastern Europe were necessary for Soviet security. FDR had given in to nearly every one of Stalin's demands, and Stalin felt that he had the upper hand. FDR hoped for Stalin to participate in the United Nations, but he was unaware that Stalin had already participated in their formation, albeit secretly. Stalin broke every agreement made at Yalta, and it was said that FDR had sold out, appeasing Stalin in a similar way that Chamberlain appeased Hitler. Harry Truman was the president at the Potsdam Conference in July. Here, an ultimatum was issued to Japan that if it did not surrender its armed forces, that its homeland would be destroyed. The Japanese tried to reply through the USSR, with who, if you remember, they were not at war at the time. The Kremlin, the seat of government in Moscow under Stalin, did not pass the message on, and Truman, thinking the Japanese had refused to reply, ordered the dropping of the bombs. Now, I'm going to finish up with starting with the Nuremberg war crimes trials, and then let's just go on. It's not that long. We can hang in there. It won't be very much longer. The Nuremberg war crimes trials began on November 20th, 1945, and resulted in the execution of 10 top-ranking Nazis, the suicide of Goering, and long imprisonments for many others. Gerhard Kittel, whose theological works were part of the basis for the New International Version of the Bible, was one of the Nazis imprisoned for his part in the destruction of millions of Jews. Kittel had not only had a hand in destroying the, quote, seed of Israel, but in trying to destroy the, quote, incorruptible seed of God's word. In China, after the Japanese had surrendered on August 10, but before the official surrender ceremony on September 2nd, an event happened that signified the Cold War to come. John Birch, American Baptist missionary and former student at J. Frank Norris's Fundamental Bible Baptist Institute, had become a second lieutenant with Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers. He had helped Doolittle's men escape the Japanese when they crash landed. On August 25th, this American hero was murdered by Chinese communists as he and a party of Chinese and Koreans attempt to free Allied prisoners from a Japanese concentration camp. The John Birch Society was founded in 1958 in his memory, and another American hero who was murdered by the Soviets in the 1980s, Larry McDonald, had been president of the society while a member of Congress. General MacArthur became military governor of Japan and instituted a tribunal to try senior Japanese officers for war crimes in Tokyo. There were over 2,000 other trials in various countries of lesser officials and military men. The Japanese military had committed mass murder, mass rape, used the forced labor of American POWs to enrich companies like Mitsubishi, machine-gunned Australian nurses, and executed many Allied POWs and civilians of conquered countries. Even acts of cannibalism on living POWs has been reported. MacArthur's merciful and enlightened reign over the conquered Japan was the determinant in the country's incredible recovery from disaster to one of America's strongest friends. MacArthur pleaded with American Christians to send missionaries as Japan was ripe for the harvest. However, American Christians, for the most part, ignored the call. Peter Sturgis Ruckman, son of a colonel working on the Manhattan Project that produced the atom bomb, grandson of the World War I general and descendant of Civil War veterans John and Wilson Ruckman, served in the occupation forces, as did one of my uncles. My uncle, in one of his letters to my father, reported that the stench of death was everywhere in late 1945. Japan was a ruined nation. MacArthur was a staunch anti-communist and would later pay a high cost for his stance. General Patton in Europe had wanted to carry his war to Soviet Russia in anticipation of the wars to come, thinking that then was the time to defeat the communists. But Eisenhower and Truman held him back. He was supposedly killed in a car accident, but many insist he was actually murdered. World War II had cost the lives of between 50 and 60 million people, including 15 million military personnel and anywhere from 35 to 45 million civilians. The numbers are staggering. 2,850,000 German soldiers alone died, with 7,250,000 wounded. The United States lost, by comparison, 292,100 dead and 571,822 wounded. The figures are enormous. At this point, the Soviet Union stands astride Eastern Europe and has actually gotten the most out of the war. It will take over 40 years of conflicts, proxy wars with America before the communist monster falls. Then it will be replaced by an Islamo-fascist monster that rises out of its ashes, keeping in mind that Saddam Hussein's hero was not Muhammad, but Joseph Stalin. Israel, after a 2,000-year absence, is about to take its place among the nations of the world. Britain will lose its empire, and America will take its place as the dominant country on earth and as the nurturer of Israel. A few more twists and turns will take place before Satan can unite the world of men against the God who created them. Now, I really think you should be able to answer questions like, at which conference were the plans for the UN drawn up? Name the 2 cities in which the atom bomb was dropped. What was the name given to the trials which brought Nazi leaders to justice? Now, these are the basics of world history after the Second World War. I began this when I started teaching world history to homeschoolers back in 2005. There are many names and dates and the few things of pages that I read, so you might feel overwhelmed, but I only suggest you take individual names and events and do an independent study on each, perhaps studying one a day. Then I recommend reading your King James Bible, the Authorized Version, each and every day. It should be a practice as you continue for the rest of your life. Judge history by the contents of its pages, as all history is judged by it. Pray unceasingly and unite yourself with a biblically sound, Bible-believing church. And I'll see you in heaven. Now, I'm going to continue on world history separately from my book. That's where my book stopped. So we're going to talk about, right after the end of the war, events that happened, get into the Cold War. There's so many interesting things going on. And then we get into the time when you might even know somebody who remembers the things I discuss. So you can ask them if you have an older relative, grandparent, or whatever. So I hope that I can continue to make this interesting and give you some interest to go off and study on your own. Thank you for listening to me.